Hey guys, today we're going to be watching our second video on Andrew Jackson, and this video will be focusing on the Indian Removal Act, in which Andrew Jackson more or less removes all of the remaining Native Americans from the eastern United States. Goals for this video? You should know what to do with these by now. So, by the year 1830, which is the time that Jackson was in the White House, white settlers had pretty much claimed most of the land east of the Mississippi. But there were still big chunks that remained in the hands of Native Americans. And you can see a map over there to the right. The yellow areas are the areas still controlled by Native American tribes around 1830. And on these chunks of land, more than 125,000 Native Americans still lived. And what most of these remaining tribes had done was become assimilated. And what it meant to become assimilated was that they had adopted many aspects of white culture. They had adopted farming, they had adopted constitutional government, and then they had even adopted slavery in the South, at least. And what this meant is it won them legal protection from the United States. The United States recognized what these guys were doing and said that basically they wouldn't steal their land anymore. They promised this. But we all know how good the promise of white people in the United States to Native Americans actually is. That is, not at all. And of course, this promise also proves to be more or less worthless. And Andrew Jackson and his Democratic Party plays a part in this. Jackson and the Democrats are champions of the West. And what this means is that they call for ever greater settlement in the American frontier. And this meant, among other things, settling the areas that were still controlled by Native Americans east of the Mississippi. And because of this, white settlers began taking land from all of the recognized tribes. It was especially bad in Georgia, which began taking land from one of the most important tribes, the Cherokee. Faced with this influx of increasingly aggressive settlers from Georgia, the Cherokee Nation decided to sue the state of Georgia. And this legal case makes it all the way up to the Supreme Court. And at the end of this case, John Marshall, who is still the head of the Supreme Court, says that Georgia is not allowed to take Cherokee land. Basically, he says that the United States agreed to give this land to the Native Americans, and it must respect this agreement, and also that the United States should try to help the Native Americans and protect them rather than continue to terrorize them. But Andrew Jackson doesn't agree with this, and he believes that Georgia should be able to take Native American land. And so basically he ignores the Supreme Court, and he says John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. And what this means is that the Supreme Court is powerless unless the executive branch is willing to listen to it. And Jackson isn't willing to listen. He ignores Marshall and goes ahead taking Native American land. After ignoring the Supreme Court's decision, Jackson signs into law the Indian Removal Act. And what this law does is it forces the Native Americans who still live east of the Mississippi to move west to new lands that the government has set aside specifically for Indians. And Jackson believes that this is the best possible thing for Native Americans because he believed that white settlers would basically never leave the Indians alone while they still wanted Indian land. And so it was better just for the Native Americans to peacefully give up their land and to take new lands further away from white settlers. The effects of the Indian Removal Act are pretty awful. So first, almost all Native Americans are removed from the eastern United States. 100,000 Native Americans at least are forced to move out of their homes. This leaves only a small remnant of the former Native American population east of the United States. Second, this forcible removal results in widespread suffering and death. The first cause of this was that there was not enough money and supplies given to the displaced Indians, so they didn't have what they needed to make the journey and to set up a new life when they got to Indian territory. Second, the forced marches exhausted the sick and the old. They were forced to march a certain distance every day, and if they weren't fit, they weren't able to keep up, and many people died of exhaustion. The worst example of this is the so-called Trail of Tears, which was when the Cherokee Nation was forced to march all the way to present-day Oklahoma. There were 15,000 people who set out on this march, and 4,000 of these people died. So almost 1/3 of all the people who set out on the march died as a result of it. And perhaps worst of all, this act results only in temporary peace for the Native Americans. Jackson had promised that this land would belong to the Native Americans forever, that it would be a new homeland. But within 15 years, white settlers had begun crossing the Mississippi and claiming this land too. So it began to seem that white people would never be satisfied, and there was nowhere left for the Native Americans to go. And this would lead to continual conflict and eventually to violent extermination of large parts of Western Native Americans.